The call came at 8:17 a.m., which was unusual enough to make me pause halfway through buttering my toast. Mark Reynolds never called this early. He preferred emails, calendar invites, things that left trails he could later deny or reinterpret. A call meant urgency, or panic. I wiped my hands on a paper towel and answered. "Don't come in today," he said immediately, without greeting me. His voice was tight, compressed, like someone speaking through clenched teeth. In the background, I could hear the familiar echo of the office, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, the low murmur of people already seated at their desks. He was there. He was early. That alone set my nerves humming. "Good morning to you too," I said, forcing a light tone. "What's going on?" A pause. I imagined him glancing over his shoulder, lowering his voice even though walls had never stopped him from eavesdropping before. "Just work from home. For today," he said. "We've got some executive-level activity, CEOs in the building." That made me straighten. Daniel Harper never showed up unannounced. In the 3 years I'd worked under Mark, the CEO had visited exactly once, and that had been scheduled weeks in advance. Company-wide emails, clean desks, smiles rehearsed in bathroom mirrors. "And that means I shouldn't be there?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "Yes," Mark said flatly. "That's exactly what it means." I glanced at the clock on my microwave. 8:19. Normally, I'd already be halfway to the office by now, coffee cooling in the cup holder, my brain shifting into work mode autopilot. The request, no, the order, felt too sudden, too specific, and somehow too personal. "Is there a problem with my work?" I asked. "No, of course not." His reply came too fast. "This isn't about you." That was the moment something settled uncomfortably in my chest. Because it was about me. I could hear it in what he wasn't saying, in the way his voice tightened around my name when he finally added, "Just log in remotely. I'll call you later." "Later when?" I pressed. "Later," he snapped, and hung up. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone like it had offended me personally. Around me, my apartment was quiet in that early morning way, sunlight slanting across the counter, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of traffic 6 floors below. Everything looked normal, too normal. I sat down slowly and thought about the timing, about the CEO, about the last 6 months of late nights, rewrites, discarded drafts turned into new directions that always seemed to originate from Mark after I'd already done the heavy lifting, about the way he'd stopped inviting me to certain meetings, started summarizing my work instead of letting me present it. Stay home. Out of sight. I opened my laptop and stared at the login screen without touching it. If this had really been about efficiency or protocol, Mark would have framed it differently. He would have praised my flexibility, thanked me for adapting. Instead, he'd sounded threatened. I imagined the office conference room, the long glass table, the chairs arranged just so. I imagined Mark standing at the front, confident smile practiced, my work laid out neatly in front of him like it had always been his. A thought crept in, quiet but persistent. My absence benefits someone. I closed the laptop. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I should enjoy the unexpected day at home, do my tasks remotely like a good employee, collect my paycheck and my praise later. That obedience was safer, simpler. But my pulse refused to slow, and my toast had gone cold without me noticing. Somewhere beneath the surface calm of my apartment, instinct was stirring. Old, sharp, impossible to ignore. "Stay home," he'd said. I picked up my keys instead. Whatever was happening at the office today, I had a feeling it wasn't meant for me to see. And that was exactly why I needed to. By the time I pulled into the parking garage, my hands were steady again, but my thoughts were not. They kept looping back to Mark's voice, to the way he'd said, "Don't come in," like it was less a suggestion and more a warning. The barrier gate rose, indifferent, and I drove inside anyway, aware that each meter forward was a choice I wouldn't be able to undo. The garage smelled of oil and concrete, familiar and grounding. I parked in my usual spot, sat for a moment, and listened to the ticking of the cooling engine. This was the point of no return. If I left now, I could still pretend I'd never been here. I could go home, log in remotely, pretend ignorance was professionalism. Instead, I took my bag and stepped out. The elevator ride up felt longer than usual. I watched the numbers climb, my reflection in the mirrored wall staring back at me. Calm face, neutral posture, nothing that hinted at the irritation simmering underneath. When the doors opened on our floor, the hum of the office rushed in like white noise. Everything looked the same. Too much the same. People were at their desks, but conversations were muted, glances cautious. A few heads turned when I walked in. Someone blinked, startled. Someone else frowned. There it was again. That barely perceptible shift in the air, like I'd walked into a room where an argument had just stopped. "Hey," Jenna from accounting said, lowering her voice as I passed. "Didn't Mark tell you to work from home today?" She sounded curious, not confrontational, but it was enough to confirm my suspicion. The order hadn't been general, it had been specific. "I forgot something," I replied smoothly, not breaking stride. A half-lie, but an effective one. She nodded, already distracted by her screen. I headed to my desk, dropped my bag, and didn't sit. Sitting implied settling in. I wasn't here for that. From where I stood, I could see the corner corridor that led to the executive conference room. The glass walls reflected movement inside, shadows, silhouettes. Mark's voice carried faintly, sharp, and rehearsed. He was in presentation mode. He was performing. I checked my phone. No messages, no follow-up call, no clarification. Good. Each step toward that corridor felt deliberate, calculated. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was focused, alert in a way I hadn't been in months. For so long, I'd second-guessed myself, told myself compromise was maturity, silence was strategy. Today, that logic felt thin, threadbare. I stopped outside the conference room. Through the frosted glass, I could see Mark pacing near the far end of the table, suit jacket off, sleeves rolled up just like he did when he wanted to appear hands-on. There were others too, but seated, peripheral. He was clearly the center. The voice I heard, calm, measured, unfamiliar, had to belong to Daniel Harper, the CEO. My presence here wasn't just unplanned, it was actively unwanted. I hesitated, just long enough for doubt to whisper. "You're risking your job. You're stepping out of line. This could backfire." But another thought followed, quieter and far more dangerous. If I walk away now, this will be the moment I regret 10 years from today. I thought about the nights I stayed late refining details no one else noticed, about emails sent after midnight, answered with vague acknowledgments and later summarized in Mark's voice to higher-ups, about recognition delayed, redirected, diluted. No, I hadn't come this far to be invisible on command. I straightened, squared my shoulders, and reached for the door handle. In that instant, before metal met skin, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't about rebellion. It was about reclaiming presence. I opened the door and stepped inside. The door hadn't even clicked shut behind me when the room reacted. Conversations fractured mid-sentence. A chair scraped back against the floor. Someone inhaled sharply, as if they'd seen something they needed to pretend they hadn't. The conference room felt tighter than it looked from the outside. Too much glass, too much light, nowhere for tension to hide. Mark was standing at the far end of the table, exactly where I'd expected him to be. Jacket off, Sleeves rolled, one hand braced against the polished surface like he needed it for balance. He turned toward the door, already halfway through a confident sentence, and then froze. For a split second, the mask slipped. His face didn't just show surprise, it showed fear. It was subtle. Mark was good at controlling himself, but I knew him well enough to recognize it. His jaw tightened too quickly. His eyes widened, then narrowed, like he was trying to force reality back into a shape he preferred. You, he started, then stopped. He cleared his throat, laughter attempting to surface and failing. What are you doing here? The question wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't angry yet. It was panicked. I felt every gaze in the room settle on me. Curiosity, confusion, irritation. Daniel Harper sat near the center of the table, posture relaxed, hands folded, observing everything without intervening. He hadn't spoken yet, but his presence was undeniable, calm in the way only true authority ever is. I work here, I said evenly. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I'm scheduled to be here today? Mark took 2 steps toward me, fast and sharp, urgency bleeding through his professionalism. No, he snapped, far too loudly. You're not. I told you to work from home. A silence followed, heavy and public. You could cut a reputation with it. That wasn't a request, he continued, lowering his voice but sharpening it at the same time. This meeting doesn't concern you. I glanced past him, at the screen behind him. My charts. My models. Even the phrasing on the slide titles was mine. I recognized my own rhythm, the way I structured ideas. He hadn't even bothered to change that. Something cold settled in my stomach. I think it might, I said. That's when he lost control. His composure shattered in a way I'd never witnessed before. The careful manager, the composed supervisor, vanished. In his place stood someone cornered. Get out, he shouted. The words echoed off the glass walls, too loud, too raw. A few people flinched. Someone coughed nervously, pretending to check their notes. No one intervened. Right now, Mark continued, pointing toward the door with a trembling hand. You are not supposed to be here. You're interrupting. Interrupting what? I asked quietly. That seemed to unnerve him even more. He took a breath, tried to rein himself back in, but the damage was done. His eyes flicked to Daniel. Just for a moment. It was a look I'd never seen him give anyone else. A plea. I don't have time for this, Mark said, turning back to me, voice strained. Leave. This is an order. The word order landed differently now. Less authority, more desperation. I didn't move. Every instinct told me that if I took even a step backward, the narrative would close without me. Whatever was about to happen, whatever this presentation truly represented, I was standing at its threshold. I was told to stay home, I said, keeping my eyes on him. No explanation, no notice, just erased from the schedule. Mark's face flushed. That was for your benefit. A lie, and a lazy one. Before I could respond, before the room could tip fully into chaos, a calm voice cut through everything like a blade through silk. That's enough. Daniel Harper finally spoke. He hadn't raised his voice, and he didn't need to. The room aligned to it instantly, like iron filings to a magnet. Mark stiffened, his hand dropping from the air as if gravity had suddenly increased. Daniel looked at him first, expression unreadable. Sit down, Mark, he said. Then his gaze shifted to me. And for the first time since I'd walked in, someone in that room wasn't looking at me like I was out of place. He was looking at me like I belonged. For a moment, no one moved. Mark remained standing, half turned toward Daniel, his authority evaporating in real time. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Daniel spoke again. Still calm, still precise. I said sit down. Mark obeyed. The motion was stiff, mechanical. He lowered himself into the chair as if afraid that any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile control he had left. I noticed then how out of place he looked. No longer the orchestrator of the meeting, just another man at the table, suddenly unsure of the script. Daniel's attention returned to me. Not in a way that felt clinical or suspicious, but measuring, considerate. Like he'd already reached a conclusion and was now confirming it against reality. "You can close the door," he said to me gently, "and take a seat." That landed harder than Mark's shout ever could have. I closed the door behind me. The muted click felt definitive, like something being sealed. As I walked toward the table, I felt every eye tracking my movement, but I no longer felt exposed. The dynamic had shifted. I could sense it as clearly as a pressure change before a storm. I took the empty chair opposite Mark. He wouldn't look at me now. Daniel folded his hands again. "Mark," he said, "you seemed quite determined that she shouldn't be here." Mark swallowed. "I was trying to keep the meeting on track." Daniel nodded slowly. "Interesting, because I invited her." The words fell softly and detonated. Mark's head snapped up. "You... what?" "I invited her," Daniel repeated, unbothered. "Specifically." The room was utterly still. The air felt electrified, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something irreversible. Mark's mouth opened, then closed. Whatever explanation he'd prepared clearly hadn't included this possibility. "But, Daniel," he said, forcing a thin smile, "there must be some misunderstanding. This meeting is about—" "My meeting," Daniel corrected. "About a project I've been monitoring for some time." His gaze never left Mark's face. "And," Daniel continued, "about the person who actually built it." I felt my pulse spike, sharp and undeniable. My hands curled slightly against my legs, the only betrayal of what that sentence meant to me. Mark laughed once. It sounded wrong, fragile. "If this is about attribution, we can discuss that privately." "No," Daniel said. "We'll discuss it now." He turned to me fully then. "You were told to stay home today." "Yes?" "Did that concern you?" "Yes," I said again. "Why?" "Because he didn't want me seen. Because my absence was convenient. Because this work mattered. And so did credit." "I felt like my absence might simplify someone else's story," I said carefully. Daniel's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something close. Approval, perhaps, or confirmation. Mark leaned forward. "This is getting out of hand." "No," Daniel said mildly. "This is getting honest." He stood then, slowly, commanding the room without effort. "Mark, you assumed control where you had none. You attempted to remove a variable you couldn't account for." He glanced at me again. "That was a mistake." The word mistake felt almost generous. I realized then that this wasn't just about exposure or credit or even betrayal. This was about power. Who wielded it, who borrowed it, and who tried to hide behind it. Daniel gestured to the screen. "Let's proceed," he said. "Together this time." And just like that, the ground Mark had been standing on disappeared. Daniel didn't sit back down. Instead, he walked slowly toward the screen, each step measured, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and wanted everyone else to feel that imbalance. The presentation froze on a slide I knew too well, because I'd built it line by line, logic stacked on logic during nights when the office lights were off except for mine. "This project," Daniel said, gesturing toward the screen, "started as an internal efficiency proposal, low priority, minimal risk, easy to overlook." Mark straightened in his chair, nodding slightly, as if familiarity alone could save him. "But," Daniel continued, "it evolved, quietly, consistently, into something far more valuable." He tapped the table once. The sound was soft, but decisive. I first noticed it when the metrics stopped behaving like projections and started behaving like outcomes. My chest tightened. He had noticed. That alone felt unreal. Daniel turned to look at me. How long did it take you to build the core model? I blinked. The question wasn't accusatory or theatrical. It was professional. Just under 4 months, I said. Another 2 refining it after feedback. What feedback? He asked. The room went still again. I glanced at Mark, who was suddenly fascinated by the edge of the table. Most of it came filtered, I said carefully. Suggestions without context, revisions without strategy explanations. Daniel nodded. So you were iterating blind? Yes. And did that stop you? No. A few people shifted in their seats. Not uncomfortably, thoughtfully. Daniel turned back to the screen and advanced the slide. More familiar layouts. More of my work. Processes I'd redesigned. Redundancies I'd eliminated. Failure points I'd reinforced because I knew exactly where things broke in the real world. Mark had always praised the results without ever discussing the decisions behind them. For 6 months, Daniel said, I've received updates on this project, presented as a collaborative effort under Mark's leadership. Mark leaned forward slightly. It was collaborative. Daniel looked at him without expression. Leadership implies understanding. Explain the second layer dependency reroute. Mark opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The fallback logic, Daniel added calmly, why it privileges internal latency over external response under load. Mark swallowed. That was a technical choice. Yes, Daniel said. By whom? Silence. I felt it then. Not triumph, not relief, but clarity. This wasn't revenge unfolding. It was exposure by precision. Daniel wasn't tearing him down. He was simply removing the scaffolding of vague authority Mark relied on. I didn't come here to embarrass you, Daniel went on. I came here because this project will be pivotal within the year. He faced the room. It scales cleanly. It adapts under stress. And it does something most internal tools don't. It anticipates human misuse. He paused. That doesn't happen by accident. His gaze settled on me. You understood the system and the people inside it. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, sharp and unwelcome. I forced myself to stay still. Daniel turned back to Mark. You attempted to remove her from this meeting. Mark exhaled shakily. I thought it would be simpler. Simpler for whom? For the narrative, Mark admitted, and then seemed to realize what he'd said. Daniel nodded once. Exactly. He returned to his seat and finally sat down. This project was the reason I came today, he said. Not the slides, not the summary emails. He gestured lightly toward me. The source. Mark's defeat didn't come with drama. It came with understanding. The delayed, devastating awareness that the work he'd claimed had finally spoken for itself. And it hadn't said his name. Mark finally spoke when silence became unbearable, when the weight of proof pressed too heavy against his chest to be ignored any longer. He cleared his throat, straightened his posture, and summoned what remained of his managerial tone, the one that had always relied on confidence rather than substance. This is being taken out of context, he said. There were misunderstandings, communication gaps, that's all. Daniel didn't interrupt. He simply leaned back and listened. Mark took that as permission. I never claimed the project wasn't collaborative, Mark continued. I only consolidated updates, streamlined communication. Someone had to speak for the team. The team? Daniel asked quietly. Mark hesitated. Yes, the team. That consisted of how many contributors? Daniel pressed. Another pause. Mark's eyes darted briefly toward me, then away. Primarily her, technically speaking. But leadership isn't about code, it's about vision. I felt the familiar sting of dismissal, The same phrase he'd weaponized for months. But now it sounded thin, almost embarrassing. Daniel nodded slowly. Vision is about understanding what you're looking at, he said, and knowing why it matters. Mark's fingers curled around the edge of the table. I trusted her. I delegated. You presented, Daniel corrected. You renamed files. You summarized decisions you didn't make. Mark's face flushed. That's not fair. No, Daniel agreed. It's accurate. Mark leaned back, the fight visibly draining from him. I didn't think it would go this far. There it was. Not remorse. Distance. As if consequences were an unexpected inconvenience rather than the inevitable result of his choices. I thought managing information would help maintain order, Mark went on. Upper leadership doesn't need complexity. They need clarity. And clarity, Daniel said, depends on truth. Mark laughed softly, bitter now. Isn't truth subjective? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to me. Did Mark ever tell you he intended to present your work as his own? He asked. No. Did he ever credit you in writing? Not once. Mark's shoulders slumped. I didn't think a mission counted as lying, he murmured. It always does, Daniel said. That's what makes it effective. The room felt heavier than before. No one spoke. No one looked at Mark anymore. He was already being mentally exiled, authority draining from him not with a bang, but with disinterest. I spent years building trust here, Mark said weakly. I didn't steal anything. I just curated. Daniel stood again, and this time there was no ambiguity in the motion. You obstructed visibility, he said. You attempted to erase attribution. And today, you attempted to remove the person most crucial to this project from the room. Mark looked up, desperation bare now. What are you saying? I'm saying, Daniel replied, that confusion is no longer an acceptable explanation. Security appeared at the glass wall, not inside yet, but close enough that Mark noticed. Daniel turned to me once more. Your work hasn't gone unnoticed, he said calmly, despite attempts to ensure it would. Mark said nothing else. There was nothing left for him to say. The lies had collapsed. Not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they had finally been asked to stand on their own. And they couldn't. Daniel waited until the door behind security closed again, leaving the conference room sealed in something quieter than tension. Resolution. Mark was still there, for the moment, but whatever power he'd once carried had been stripped down to title alone, and even that felt temporary now. Daniel returned to his seat and steepled his fingers. He didn't look at Mark when he spoke next. This is the point where most situations like this end, he said. A breach is acknowledged. Responsibility is reassigned. The company moves on. Mark swallowed hard. But, Daniel continued, finally lifting his gaze, this isn't just about correction. It's about direction. He turned to me. I felt the shift immediately, the room narrowing, every unspoken implication converging on that single movement. I straightened instinctively, though I didn't realize I'd been leaning forward until then. I've been reviewing your work for some time, Daniel said. Not casually, closely. Mark's head snapped up. You've been watching her? Yes, Daniel replied flatly. You just weren't aware of it. That landed like a second verdict. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city below. There are two ways to handle what's happened here, he said. Both are fair. He turned back to me. The first, he said, is formal recognition. You take official leadership of this project, full authority, full visibility. Your name goes on it, publicly, internally, permanently. My breath caught. The second, Daniel continued, is exposure. Mark stiffened. Exposure? Daniel nodded. A full internal audit, Every email, every revision history, every instance of misattribution laid out transparently. Mark's face blanched. He looked at me then, truly looked at me for the first time, not as a resource, not as a subordinate, but as the person holding the lever. Daniel's voice was steady. Both outcomes end with you in the role you deserve. The difference is in collateral. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence didn't belong to Mark. It belonged to me. I hadn't expected a choice. Revenge fantasies are loud, seductive. They tell you justice comes from spectacle, from watching someone fall the way you once did. And part of me, an honest part, felt the pull of that second option. The cleanse, the reckoning, the undeniable proof. But I also thought about the work. The project didn't deserve to be a battleground. It was careful, precise, built to endure. Dragging it through public fallout would scar it, perhaps permanently. I met Daniel's gaze. If I lead? I asked. What happens to him? Mark's breath hitched. Daniel didn't soften his response. Mark will no longer be in a position of oversight or influence. His future here, if any, will not intersect with yours. That was enough. I looked back at Mark. He said nothing. He already knew. I want to lead the project, I said. The words settled into place with surprising calm, not triumph. Alignment. Daniel nodded once. That tells me more than either choice alone would have. Mark closed his eyes. This is not mercy, Daniel added, glancing at him briefly. It's prioritization. He turned back to me. Authority will be formalized today. Transition begins immediately. I felt something unlock in my chest. Not relief, exactly, but confirmation. The sense that the long stretch of self-doubt I'd been carrying had finally been answered, not with reassurance, but with responsibility. Daniel stood again. Mark, he said, this meeting is over for you. Security reappeared, this time entering the room. Mark rose slowly, his movements heavy, mechanical. As they guided him toward the door, he paused and looked back at me. For a moment, I expected anger. What I saw instead was understanding, late, bitter, and useless. The door closed behind him. Daniel turned back to me. Welcome to ownership, he said simply. And just like that, the terms were set. Mark didn't resist when security approached him. That was the strangest part. No shouting, no final attempt to reclaim authority, no threats disguised as legal language. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket with trembling fingers, and let himself be guided toward the door like someone already aware the verdict had been decided long before the trial. The room watched in silence. As he walked, I noticed details I'd never paid attention to before. The slight stoop in his shoulders, the way his confidence had always been a posture rather than a foundation. Up close, stripped of context and control, he looked smaller. Ordinary. He stopped once, just short of the door. This isn't how it was supposed to end, he said quietly, not to Daniel, but to the room. Or maybe only to himself. Daniel didn't respond. Security waited. Mark exhaled shakily and nodded, the faintest gesture of resignation, then continued. The door closed behind him with a muted click. No dramatics, no applause, just absence. The effect was immediate and unsettling. Without Mark in the room, something else rushed in. Clarity. Conversations that had always felt filtered now seemed sharper, more honest. People sat straighter. Breathing slowed. Power had changed hands, and everyone could feel it. Daniel remained standing, his expression unreadable but composed. For the record, he said, addressing the room, this decision wasn't made lightly. No one contradicted him. Mark's removal is effective immediately, Daniel continued. Any access privileges he held are revoked as of now. I heard the quiet rustle of phones as someone, somewhere, likely carried out the instruction. Daniel turned slightly toward the door Mark had exited through. Leadership built on obscurity cannot survive scrutiny, he added. Let this be the last time we need to relearn that. The meeting dissolved shortly after. People gathered their things more quietly than usual, avoiding my eyes, not out of resentment, but reassessment. I understood. In their place, I might have done the same, witnessing a fall that sharp forces everyone to reevaluate the ground they stand on. As they filed out, a few paused. That was something, Jenna murmured, offering a cautious smile before leaving. I nodded, unsure what else to do with the attention. Eventually, the room emptied until only Daniel and I remained. The glass walls reflected the city skyline, now dipped slightly lower in the afternoon light. Dust motes floated lazily through the air, oblivious to the shift that had just occurred. For the first time since walking into the office that morning, the tension left my shoulders. Mark Reynolds was gone. Not reassigned, not redirected, removed. The finality of it pressed in slowly, like a delayed wave. There was no satisfaction in it, no vindictive pleasure. Just a stark understanding of how fragile authority really is when it's built on appropriation instead of competence. Daniel glanced at the door once, then back to me. Falls are rarely loud, he said. They just feel that way to the person falling. I didn't answer. I was still absorbing the fact that the man who had once controlled my career trajectory no longer had any say in it at all. Somewhere down the hall, I heard voices resume, tentative at first, then normalizing. The office was moving on. But I knew something fundamental had changed. Mark had always believed control meant exclusion, deciding who belonged in the room. Today, that belief had been inverted completely. He hadn't lost power because of confrontation. He'd lost it because he'd been seen. The silence that followed Mark's removal felt different from the ones before it. It wasn't heavy or sharp anymore. It was spacious, like a room that had finally been cleared of unnecessary furniture. Daniel remained by the table, reviewing something on his tablet, giving me the courtesy of a moment to exist inside what had just happened. I stood near the window, watching the city move below us. Cars flowed in obedient lines. People crossed streets, unaware that my entire professional gravity had just shifted. It struck me how indifferent the world was to turning points. They only feel monumental from the inside. You handled that well? Daniel said at last. I turned. I didn't say much. Exactly, he replied. You didn't need to. He set the tablet down and studied me openly now, without pretense. This wasn't assessment anymore. It was confirmation. I've been aware of you since your second quarter here, he said, before the project. That surprised me. Really? Yes. You don't perform for attention. That makes your output clean. Signals stand out when there's no noise. I absorbed that quietly. So many nights of wondering whether restraint was weakness, whether waiting my turn meant forfeiting it. Today wasn't spontaneous, Daniel continued. The visit, the meeting, even Mark's panic. I raised an eyebrow. You expected him to react like that? I expected him to try to control the environment, Daniel said. People who trade invisibility always do. He stood and joined me by the window. What I didn't know, he added, was whether you'd obey. I shifted slightly. The stay-home order. Yes. He looked at me then, directly. That was the test. I exhaled slowly. And if I had stayed home? Daniel didn't dodge the question. You would have remained valuable, he said, but not essential. The honesty stung, but it was clean. Precision without cruelty. Organizations need competence, he went on, but they promote presence. Today, you demonstrated both. He gestured toward the empty conference room. Authority isn't taken by volume. It's taken by occupying the space when it matters. I thought back to the door handle, to the second before I'd opened it. I wasn't trying to challenge him, I said. I just didn't want to disappear. Daniel smiled faintly. That's usually how real challenges begin. We returned to the table. He pulled a folder from his bag and slid it toward me. Your new role, he said. Interim title for now. Official announcement by end of day. I didn't open it yet. Your team will change, he continued. Your influence will expand. Your work will be questioned more openly. I expect that. Good, he said. If no one pushes back, you're not doing anything meaningful. He stood once more and gathered his things. There will be resistance, he added calmly. Some of it subtle, some of it polite. I met his gaze. I can handle it. I know, he said. That's why you're here. At the door, he paused. One more thing, he said. You weren't promoted because Mark failed. I waited. You were promoted because you showed up when exclusion was easier. The words settled deeper than any praise had before. After he left, I sat alone in the conference room for a long time. I finally opened the folder, scanned the title, the scope, the authority it granted. It was real, tangible, earned. Outside, the office was returning to its rhythm. Emails would be sent, calendars updated, narratives adjusted. But one truth would remain unchanged. I hadn't been given a seat. I'd claimed it. By the time the office began to empty, the adrenaline had finally worn off. It left behind something quieter, heavier. Not doubt, but weight. The kind that comes from realizing nothing is hypothetical anymore. Titles had shifted. Authority had moved. And tomorrow, people would arrive expecting me to be someone slightly different than the person they'd left behind that evening. I shut down the conference room lights and stepped into the hallway. The glass walls reflected me back in fragments, my outline broken into angles and shadows. I looked the same, and I didn't. Desks were clearing out as I passed. Low voices, careful laughs, the familiar end-of-day ritual. A few people nodded at me, tentative but respectful. Others avoided my gaze entirely, filing today's events into whatever internal categories helped them sleep at night. I didn't blame them. In the kitchenette, someone had left a mug in the sink. A screen flashed with an unread calendar reminder belonging to someone who no longer worked here. The office hadn't had time to catch up with reality yet. That would come tomorrow, or the day after. I returned to my desk for the last time that day, packed my bag slowly, deliberately. No rushing now. No need to prove urgency. For the first time in years, time felt like something I was allowed to take up. As I walked toward the elevators, I passed Mark's old office. The door was ajar, empty. The desk cleared except for faint outlines where objects used to be. A chair pushed in neatly, as if he might return any moment and pick the day back up where he'd left off. He wouldn't. His story here had ended without ceremony, without revision. I felt no joy at the sight, just finality. The elevator doors closed behind me, and as I descended, I thought about how close I'd come to not being there at all. One obedient choice, one unchallenged instruction. How easily the day could have passed without resistance, without consequence. Outside, the evening air was cool, the city vibrant and unaware. People hurried past carrying groceries, answering calls, living inside trajectories that made sense only to them. I joined the flow, my footsteps steady on the sidewalk. Nothing about the street knew what had happened, but I did. I knew that power doesn't announce itself when it shifts. It waits until you notice you're no longer asking permission to exist in the spaces that matter. It arrives quietly, after silence, after the moment you realize you're no longer invisible. I didn't look back at the building as I walked away. Tomorrow, I would return not as someone hoping to be seen, but as someone already accounted for. The uncertainty that had shadowed me for so long was gone, replaced by something far more demanding: expectation. Today, I hadn't defied a supervisor. I hadn't exposed a lie. I hadn't even won. I had done something far simpler and far harder. I had shown up. And this time, I wasn't leaving quietly.